Hey, this is WVLP 103.1 FM, Valparaiso Community Radio, and you're listening to Everyday Warriors. My name is Danny McGuire, your host. Everyday Warriors is about a show about the warriors of every day, the true heroes, the people in our society that do work every day and actually contribute to our society. We don't do politics. We don't talk about politics. We don't talk about politicians. We don't talk about athletes. We don't talk about music stars. We talk about the real people of today that do really good things for their community. Today, our guest is Jackie Augustine. She's the owner of Jacqueline Augustine and Associates in New Lenox, Illinois. She's a licensed clinical psychologist, and we're going to talk to Jackie a little bit today about trauma and what that looks like. Jackie, thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Jackie, why don't you take time to tell our listeners who you are, give us your background, your education, what you've done for a living in the way of psychology, and I'll let you take it from here.
Awesome. Yeah, I've been in the field over 15 years now. I grew up in the west suburbs of Chicago, right on the border of the city. I come from a family of first responders, firefighter. My uncle is now a retired police officer. My husband's a police officer. So I feel really strongly about this community and really feel strongly about using what I know about trauma and mental health and providing those services for this population, which is really greatly in need right now. So I've been treating people of all ages and with a mix of different therapies, but all research supported. And I see anything from depression, anxiety, OCD, self-injury, and trauma, of course. And I also do assessment. So testing people for learning disabilities and clarifying diagnosis. So I do a wide variety of things.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks for sharing. Where did you get your degrees?
I got my bachelor's degree from Northern Illinois, and I was able to do some research while I was there as part of the honors program where I assisted graduate students. I did my own dissertation on anxiety, and then I went on to the Illinois School of Professional Psychology, and I got my doctorate there. And during that time, I did a lot of clinical training in pretty much any setting you could find. So I did a couple inpatient programs, a therapeutic day school, outpatient behavioral health, and I've worked in the community mental health system in Chicago. So,
wow, that's a full plate of experience, right?
Yeah, it's been fun. It's been really interesting.
With a side of fun. Holy cow. So you specialize in trauma treatment, or are there other things you specialize in as well?
I specialize in a lot of things. I've really been open to taking on kind of anything, and it's afforded me some really good experiences with a wide variety of things. So trauma, anxiety being a big one, phobias, OCD, and then I also work with people that struggle with disordered eating of all kinds. And I work with people with very severe depression or who tend to have chronic suicidal ideation or self-injury, things like that. So I see all of that, but anxiety and depression is sort of the base for all these issues. And I use a lot of those evidence-based treatments together for all these issues, actually.
Jackie, can you explain to our listeners a little bit about what an evidence-based treatment, like something you're talking about? Like I know it's CBT, like cognitive behavioral therapy is an evidence-based treatment, right? Because, as an intern, I've used those things as well. So can you explain to our listeners a little bit about what that means and some of the evidence-based treatments that may be used?
Yeah. So when you hear evidence-based treatment, that means this treatment has been tested and applied to clinical populations, and it's been compared to general populations, and they look at the results and determine if it's effective in the long term, short term and long term. And so when someone is saying they're using evidence-based treatment, that means they're using something that's been tried and true and it's known to work. And so it's not one of those things that are maybe a fad therapy, or they don't have much research on yet, and they're just sort of really solid.
Very good. So what are some of those evidence-based treatments?
Yeah, evidence-based treatments would be cognitive behavioral therapy. You'll hear someone say like CBT. Another one is dialectical behavior therapy. It's very similar and very skills-based, but people refer to that as DBT. And then there's things like exposure-based therapy, exposure response prevention. Those are used for people that do have trauma, phobias, OCD, panic disorder, and things like that. There's narrative therapy, which is very related to trauma. Cognitive processing therapy, similar to CBT, but it's another one we use for a wide variety of things, but notably trauma as well. Trying to think what else. Those are the ones I mainly do. Family systems is another thing I use because I do work with a lot of families, and the concepts can be easily woven into what you're doing. And when you're treating someone, you really, if you can, it is ideal and you get the best treatment outcome if you can incorporate supports, you can incorporate family. So you kind of need to know that background of family systems to really help the whole system.
That's great. That's great stuff. So, when you're talking, I'm taking notes, right? So one of the notes, and again, I know what this is, but for our listeners, I kind of want to clarify because sometimes, and I don't know, maybe you experience this, but when I deal with first responders, in my experience, sometimes they're a little resistant to come and get some help. And they're like, well, what are you going to be doing to me? Are you going to be examining my brain? And I'm like, that's not necessarily what I'm doing. Right. So, sometimes they need, people in general, I think, need a little explanation to kind of push them through the door.
Yeah.
So to speak, when they're on the fence, like, should I go to a therapist? Should I not go to a therapist? Should I go to a psychologist? Should I not go to a psychologist? So maybe you could take just, however long it takes to explain, like, CBT seems to be the most popular thing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, would you say exposure and CBT and DBT? You named them the first three. So could you tell our listeners a little bit, like, what's CBT and what's it look like cognitive behavioral therapy? What is it and what does it do?
Yeah. So it sounds maybe kind of serious. And it's really just, we start with just having a conversation. I'm not doing a interview with a clipboard and asking you, firing questions at you. I'm really just opening up that first session with what's going on, what's going on in your life, how are your relationships, how are you feeling every day. And as you're talking about your day to day, I'm asking some questions about, I'm thinking about symptoms and I'm thinking about your relationships and your distress level. And then from there, we develop a treatment plan. We kind of identify what's going on, what do you want help with, what is suffering in your life, and then we identify specific goals. And with CBT, those goals might look like, let's look at how are you perceiving the world, what is your self-perception, what are your thoughts and your views, because that is the cognitive part. That word cognitive really relates to your thoughts and beliefs about yourself, the world, your future. And a lot of times people have depression, anxiety because there's something going on there that could be shifted in a healthier way. And with CBT and even cognitive processing therapies like this and DBT, they're all very similar in this way that you're examining the way you look at things and trying to find a way to look at it in a new way that helps you feel better and adapt better and live your life in a better way. So it really affects they're connected, your feelings and your thoughts. So that's what it is. A lot of it is questions and talking in a conversation in a safe way,
So what I hear you saying, and the cognitive behavioral therapy model would be like your thoughts affect your feelings that affect your behaviors. Yep. Right. So in CBT, our goal is to change the thoughts. So the feelings change and then the behaviors change. Right.
Yes.
Is that kind of what we're talking about?
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. That it's funny because sometimes when dealing with a first responder, and those listening know what I'm talking about. When you come in, you don't know how to take it. You don't know if you should be there or not. The mystique of it, back in 1992, when I became a police officer, and went through some things, I started going to a therapist like in, I think, 1994. And I remember people telling me, don't tell anybody you're going to a therapist. They're going to think you're crazy, and don't use your insurance because then they're going to know you're going to a therapist. And it's like, that's all fake. And that's one of the things that when someone would come in to talk to me, and maybe you have a similar
Mhm.
experience where they're like, they don't want their employer to know that they're getting this help. But nowadays, many departments have EAP programs where first responders could go and get help. It's free, and it's a very good resource. So
Yeah,
I don't necessarily think that going to somebody and telling somebody about how you feel and them working with you to help you feel better, maybe your
right,
behavior changes, is a good thing.
right.
I think it's a great thing, right?
Hmm.
So you mentioned when we were talking about suicide ideation, right?
Hmm.
It seems to be an epidemic in first responder culture. The suicide rate is fairly high.
Yeah.
And you had mentioned that a lot of the things we deal with trauma, that you deal with trauma, has to deal with anxiety, depression, maybe PTSD. How do you think that all correlates to suicide? What do you think that all ties in? Why does it look that way?
I think part of the reason that you're seeing such a high rate of suicide in first responders and people with trauma is if they don't feel they have access to supports, or even if they do, but their perception is that they don't have access to supports, they're not addressing the issues, they're highly agitated, or they're using substances. Um, they're more likely, like if they're not facing their problems and working through it, they're more at risk of committing suicide. And so that's kind of what's happening in that community, is for a lot of the reasons you just stated, that feelings, the stigma around mental health, the concerns about whether they need it or what that would look like to get mental health support, it's really kept them from feeling free to access that resource, and they're just sort of dealing with it, or whatever that means, when they have trauma, and they're not really dealing with it. They're just really shutting off their emotions and avoiding it. So I think, and with trauma, that is the thing that fuels the anxiety with trauma. It's avoidance, and it's not in a safe, gradual way confronting the experience and those feelings. It just fuels and breeds anxiety and makes it worse. And so that's what's happening. It's getting exacerbated, and then there's no resources, there's no help. They're not accessing that help.
I couldn't agree more with your professional opinion. And avoidance, right? And substances. And full disclosure, I'm recovering alcoholic myself, and I've played the game where you get sober, you relapse, you get sober, you relapse, because the demons tell you you can control it. And when someone will call me and say, hey Danny, how do you know you have a problem? I'm like, well, if you're calling me and talking about it, you probably think you have a problem, right off the bat. And then in our conversation, they'll say, well, what's, getting sober, what's the hard part? I'm like, for me, and this is just for me, and maybe some of our listeners can identify with this, with my drinking, thinking you can control it, and then going back after a relapse. I remember the first time I quit drinking for 6 years, 6 years, 11 months and 2 weeks, right before my 7th year anniversary, I decided I'm just going to drink. And I remember that night having like 25 beers. You know what I mean? Like I hit the ground right where I left off. Like, you know what I mean? And I was sick as a dog, and just stupid decisions. And I noticed that when you're sober, you have to fight with your demons. That goes to the avoidance, right? The avoidance thing. When I'm drinking, I don't have to deal with the demons. The demons are happy. They're like, yeah, you're going to be, you're going to take yourself out pretty soon, whether it's by your own hand or by drinking. So we're happy that you're suffering because we're demons. And when you're sober, you have to battle those demons.
Yep.
And you have to make some pretty strong decisions. And that takes a lot of work.
Yes. Yes.
Would you agree with that?
Oh, totally. That is totally what's happening. I think a lot of people that go through trauma, or if it's not even totally trauma, but just intense anxiety about their jobs or depression, it's easier to shut off emotions and not face it, and then use substances to self-medicate, basically.
Oh, 100%. The more beers I could have, the more the demons were out.
Mhm.
I didn't even think of it. I thought of, goofy things, like
Yeah.
stupid stuff. So that's great. Thanks for putting that in there. I found that sometimes using self-disclosure, particularly with first responders, and again, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I know that we're supposed to limit our self-disclosure in
Mhm.
therapy, but I found with first responders, particularly if I do some self-disclosure when they're struggling with, do I have an addiction problem? We know they have an addiction problem. And then telling them, well, you know what? I'm an addict myself when it comes to alcohol. I have zero control. Zero. If I have one, I'm going to have 100.
Yeah. Right.
So using that self-disclosure, I think sometimes pushes them through that door we talked about earlier.
Mhm.
It says,
Yeah.
okay, well, if he does, then maybe I do too. If
Right.
she does, maybe I do too. I'm not suggesting Jackie's an alcoholic. I'm just saying Jackie is, our resident expert and our guest today.
Yeah.
Jackie, I found this article in johnhopkinsmedicine.org, and it was from April of 2010. We're going to circle back to suicide here.
Okay.
The article says that losing a parent to suicide makes children more likely to die by suicide themselves and increases the risk of developing a range of major psychiatric disorders. What do you think of that?
I totally believe it. I could totally see that. I mean, I know we see an uptick in suicides when you hear about suicide, and when there's a large amount of, like, for example, in the high schools, this is something that's happening now. There's an increase in the amount of suicides in adolescents, and for those hearing about it or friends, there's an uptick in suicides just by experiencing and listening to it. So I can't even imagine how it would be for a child to find their parent that way, and how it could not increase the likelihood, and just everything they will go through now from that point forward is just extremely difficult. So yeah, I totally could see that.
I just literally had a text message come in from a friend that said, if you have, and I'll read this, I won't say who it is, but it's relevant to what we're talking about, which is amazing that I got this text message. And it says, Danny, hope everything is well. I have a friend who's a police officer, and I won't say where, it's a suburban police department, that is having a tough time struggling. I believe he may have an alcohol problem, and I think he is suicidal. What advice can you give me, or what direction can you push me in? And we're just talking about this, right?
Yeah.
And here's the text message, right? Substances, suicide,
Yes.
first responder.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it's effective for someone who's an aspiring counselor or therapist for first responders to use information like this in the Johns Hopkins article when they're doing suicide ideation? You have a police officer come in. I'm gonna paint a scenario for you, and you tell me if it's a reasonable scenario. And you look at the person, you say, are you thinking about hurting yourself? And they look at you and say, yeah. Right. And then you ask them a question like, well, how do you plan on doing that? Well, I'm going to shoot myself with my gun.
Mm-hmm.
And, well, when are you going to do this? I'm going to do it tonight. And where? I'm going to do it in my house. Where? In your bedroom. In my bedroom. Why? Because I want my wife to find me that way. Do you think going in a direction with this first responder and giving them this information about, they have children, do you think that this is useful in helping them with their suicide ideation?
Yep, definitely. For two reasons. One, first of all, you're doing a really great thing by opening up the conversation and talking very in detailed ways about what they're thinking about, which for someone that experiences suicidal ideation, that's relieving, because they've probably not talked about it in that depth with anyone. So right then and there, you're treating it, which is great. And the second reason is you get a read, and you're assessing risk, and you get a read on, one, how far have they thought about it, prepared, their access to means. And if you present this information, and that it can go one or two ways, it could deter them and they could be really shocked and it could move them in a way that they didn't realize or think about this. Or if they look at you and really honestly don't have a reaction, that tells you a lot also about the risk. So you're looking at the reaction to that, how they take into that information. And for some people, that might be what keeps them from doing it. You're always weighing, what are their reasons for living? What are their reasons for dying? And you're sort of looking at that ratio. And when you have someone with more reasons for dying than living, that's a really high level of risk. And when children come into the picture, most people tend to list that as a reason for living, or family,
Yes. And to further that, something that I think, again, for our aspiring first responder counselors out there, because there are people that really want to work on trauma and do want to work with first responders. In a situation like that, do you think something like would be effective where you would tell that first responder, like, well, what if your wife doesn't find you? You want her to find you, but what if it's your child coming home from school and they find you?
Yeah.
I think that would correlate with that article. I'm not suggesting that, that's perfect, but perhaps it keeps them from making the ultimate decision, taking a permanent solution to a temporary issue, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what it is, isn't it? I mean, did you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah. And exploring what that would look like, the aftermath. I think that's something I've heard a lot of people not, when we've talked about this so openly, getting them to think about what does that look like for your family and the aftermath and the fallout. And really family will never really recover from that, especially kids in a sense. So they need to sometimes they've never really thought that through. And that is really important information for them to be examining, I think.
So I found another article because I do this, right? I find these articles. It's a Chicago Tribune article. So it's, a for-profit news organization, right? And, it's from February 8th of 2013. So almost 10 years ago. And apparently 3 Waukegan police officers killed themselves since May of 2011. The chief of police had sent an email out to the department saying, and it quotes and again, it's in Tribune, it quotes, and this is from February of 2013. It said that in a January 19th email, the chief sent out to the department, these suicides, and it's a quote, these suicides were about personal choice, selfishness, and weakness. Do you think that's something positive to say? Oh, wow. So I know what your answer is going to be, but please expound on the, oh, wow.
That is like, if that's exactly what you don't say. So yeah, no, that's not what you want to send. That is absolutely not what you want, the message you want to send out to people.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I recently I was teaching a wellness class at Calumet College of St. Joseph. In the undergraduate program, I teach a wellness class. And one of the days I cover trauma. I cover police suicide. I cover, sleep, nutrition, exercise. So in the police suicide class, one of the officers, there was a suicide, and they shared a department email, and they said, no one ever really, it's just vanilla. That's the word they use to describe it. Vanilla. It's just plain email. This police officer committed suicide. So they're like, why do you think that is? And I'm like, wow, you're putting me on the spot. The leader in me, the guy with the doctorate in leadership, says I put out an email like that because if people are looking to get attention, like they're in this place where they feel alone and they think that this is the way they're going to get attention, like now attention's brought on them. Now everyone knows their name, right? I really don't want that happening. But the counselor intern in me wants to pay attention to what's going on and maybe highlight that to help others. It's kind of a fine line, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I can understand where that chief would say something. I understand it. I don't agree with it. Let me say that. I understand, and that's kind of an old school way, like
right.
The 30-year ago police officer, Danny, working somewhere, people would say, well, what do you mean you're bothered by this? Just go have a case of Miller Lite, drink a half a bottle of JMO, you'll be fine. Right.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And that's not necessarily the right way to handle things like that. And I think that was a little old school, but
Yeah.
walking that fine line between showing too much attention to something, and not wanting it to grow,
Right.
and helping, sometimes it's like a gray area. Do you agree or disagree?
Yeah. I think maybe people don't exactly know what to say to their other officers who are also hearing this. And I think that response to why someone committed suicide in the first responder community, that, it's a way to create distance from doing something like that and who you are as a first responder. Many first responders might hear that and think that'll never be me. I would never do that, because that's too scary. And, they don't, maybe I don't want to admit that maybe this profession is leading us down a really scary path. So if they can attribute that to something personally going on with that person, it has nothing to do with my job. It has nothing to do with, I'm tougher than that. I'm made for this job. Like, that would never be me. It's an easy way to sort of create a false sense of security around yourself that this couldn't be you. Kind of reassures people, lowers their anxiety or their feelings around it. I don't know. I think maybe that might be a reason he's trying to create a sense of security, maybe in people who are hearing about it.
At the time that article came out, I was the program director of police psychology at the Adler School of Professional Psychology, where I got my counseling psychology degree. And I remember writing a response to that email, and I sent it to the chief. I never heard back, but I had written about it. It originally was about 10 pages. As you found out earlier, I can talk, right? So I and I tend to translate that talking into writing, right? So I had written a response. It was originally 10 pages, and I cut it down to 2. And I made it pretty short and effective. I never heard back from that chief. I don't even know if he read it, but at the time I offered to sit down and talk to him about doctorate in leadership. I've never been a chief of police, so I don't have that experience, but I do understand how you lead people and how you get people to do things, and being a servant leader, an authentic leader, is important. And I also understand psychology, and I also understand, how to listen to people and have empathy.
Yeah.
I've never committed suicide, so I can't sympathize, but I can empathize. Right. And I often say this, I played in the police bagpipe band for a long time, from 1990 to about 2010, 11. I played a lot of police funerals, a lot of fire funerals. I played all the in line of duty deaths. I did all that stuff, not just in Chicago, but all over the place. And I've known 3 officers that have been killed in line of duty personally, not just in Chicago, but other places. But now I know 35 police officers who killed themselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
So thinking of that, it really drives it home that, when they say you're more likely to die by your own hand, according to the International Association of Chiefs of Police, you're more likely to die by your own hand than you are in the line of duty.
Right. Yep. That is the trend, that unfortunately there are more deaths by suicide than on the line of duty. That is true.
Absolutely.
It says a lot about what's going on and what is happening in this profession,
Right. In services.
Yeah.
Getting out there, awareness. So I have to break for station identification, and then I'd like to stay on topic, but change it a little bit. So here we go. This is WVLP 103.1 FM, Valparaiso Community Radio. You're listening to Everyday Warriors. I am your host, Danny McGuire, and we have our guest, Jackie Augustine of Jacqueline Augustine and Associates in New Lenox, Illinois, licensed clinical psychologist. And we are talking today about an array of issues related to psychology and first responders and things like that. Now I just want to talk about your regular trauma treatment. Let's say I'm a parent of a special needs child. All right. And I have an adult special needs child. And it's been very difficult because I've been dealing with it for 20 years. So, that is a traumatic event to some people.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to recover. So now I'm just a special need parent, and I'm looking for some help. Right? What would you tell me if I saw you at a conference speaking and I said, Dr. Augustine, I have a special needs child and I'm just depressed. I'm anxious. I've read all these articles online. I've read Wikipedia and WebMD, and I've done all these things and, psychology.org and all this stuff. And it tells me that I have major depression and I might be a narcissist and something else. Right. So you got to love the internet. What do you tell that person?
Oh, I would just be strongly encouraging them to meet with a licensed mental health professional and start getting in for some, therapy. And in those sessions, and I have treated quite a number of parents actually who have had kids with either chronic mental illnesses or chronic medical issues. And they most definitely have some PTSD happening because of just what you go through trying to, in those really scary situations, taking care of your child and always being worried and hyper vigilant, to something happening. And over time, it really takes a toll. And so we would be looking at, anxiety symptoms. How much are you able to even talk about the events that have happened? Those are things we would be exploring in therapy. And that touches on the exposure component of exposure-based therapies. So the rationale is the more that you talk about it or write about it or have some kind of, safe, gradual exposure to the trauma over time, that is what is allowed people to not, feel the same level of anxiety when talking about it or have that reaction. And it frees up your cognitive resources to not be so consumed and stuck on the trauma and really be doing other things. So, we would be doing some exposure-based work. We'd probably be doing some what we call narrative therapy, where they write about the experience and they talk about it. And each time you write, you're writing more detail and more vivid details about what's happened. And then you're reading it over. And so, that's how people, every time they read it, actually start to make conclusions and put things together that they didn't think about before.
I saw a talk show, and there was a woman on there, some national organization of a special needs type family. And my special needs in my house is autism. My son Danny's, low functioning autism. Psychological evaluation. He's 21 years old. He'll be 22. Puts him at 3-year-old functioning and 2 years, 9 months functioning. Right. So you understand these things,
Yep.
when you're doing your assessments. So, I've been dealing with it, and I have a strong support system. So I'm okay. Right. But there's families that are not. And I remember watching this talk show, and this woman made this statement, and it just it rang my bell. And she says, parents of special needs children do not have PTSD. They have Cptsd. Can you explain to us, our listeners, can you explain to us what PTSD is and what Cptsd is, and maybe some of the things to look for people that might have this? Because it correlates not only most of the first responders, right? We know this, but it's also people in the community. And could you tell us also who may suffer from something like this? Like what kind of events would happen to lead someone to have PTSD? Go.
Yeah. So PTSD is when someone experiences a really, traumatic event, a
post-traumatic stress disorder, correct?
Right.
Post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right. So it's, an event, you're witnessing, a death, you're witnessing an assault, you're a victim of an assault, or you're going through a extremely emotionally distressing event, like caring for someone that, at any moment could have a seizure and might die or something, like with a child who has a chronic medical illness. And over time, what happens is, because you're what they call hypervigilant, you're in this constant fight or flight mode. It takes a toll on you, and people their bodies start responding to that with things like poor sleep or nightmares, feeling, high startle response, feeling shaky, avoidant behavior, sort of like reliving the experience, whatever that trauma was. And the natural reaction to those symptoms is for people to want to avoid talking about it. So, and a lot of times I hear parents say that they didn't really realize that it was a trauma until maybe their child was in remission, or they had some time to sit and pause and actually think about how they felt. And they're like, why is this affecting me now? Because all the while they're sort of distracted or purposely distracting themselves from, feeling and thinking as a way to survive. So they kind of go in survival mode. Cptsd is it's like complex. It's related. It's very similar, complex PTSD. And so, I mean, essentially you would be treating them the same in many ways, with exposure and cognitive behavioral therapy and talking about the events that people really are trying to avoid. I think there was another part to your question too.
Yeah, the Cptsd, complex PTSD. What's the difference between the PTSD and the complex PTSD?
Well, in terms of complex PTSD, so the similarities are, they have flashbacks, unstable mood, and things like that. But with complex PTSD, it sort of affects people's long-term, over the long term, so, because there's so multi-layered trauma, maybe it's multiple things that are going on. It's not one trauma, maybe it's multiple traumas. Those things are way more difficult to unpack and treat. And so it's kind of more severe in a sense, if that could even be possible.
It makes sense. Now, when you treat people with PTSD and Cptsd, I apologize. Some of the resources that I see out there are Emdr. Can you explain what Emdr is and how it's used to treat somebody with PTSD? Now, for our listeners here, PTSD is something that affects our veterans that come home from war, people that have major trauma, police officers that are involved in traumatic incidents, and PTSD can manifest itself. And correct me if I'm wrong here, Dr. Augustine, if you don't have to necessarily be a police officer that's involved in like a shootout or some kind of deadly situation. You could come to an accident and see a family of 4 dead,
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that could be a traumatic incident. I mean, you don't have to be, some, movie Steven Seagal, cop, and you're walking around the streets killing everybody, because we know that happens every day. That's sarcasm for our listeners. It doesn't happen every day. Police officers, believe it or not, are not out there killing people by the bushel, as some mainstream media may have you believe. It's just not true. It's simply not true. But it could be that, right? I mean, it could be like coming to a scene where you find a family dead, or murder, suicide, or an accident, and these things can manifest themselves. Now, is EMDR a treatment for this? And can you explain a little bit what that is?
Yeah, it is similar to exposure. It's got some of the same elements to the therapy. EMDR is this eye movement desensitization and reprocessing treatment, where people explore the traumatic event, and that's the exposure part, where they're talking about it, or having some kind of contact with elements of whatever the event was, and while also focusing on an external stimulus, which tends to be the hand movement. And so over time, it's been known to help people relieve some of the negative distress they experience because of the event, like anxiety, depression, flashbacks, all those things. So
excellent. Is there any other treatments that are used for PTSD, Cptsd? Some of the articles I've read said that CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, what we talked about earlier, exposure therapy, things like that, do also help.
Yes, it's in cognitive behavioral therapy, we would be looking at, in that situation, I would be using an integration of both, because we'd be talking about the event and examining your thoughts and beliefs about what happened and why, and maybe getting some perspective on the other people involved, the other things affecting how that even happened, so we're exploring those beliefs. And then the exposure part is just talking about it for people is really scary. With PTSD, one of the elements that really fuels it is this avoidance, so most of the time they do not want to talk about it or even come in contact with, it could be a song or it could be a smell that reminds them of the event. So they will avoid that at all costs. And so that trigger can often trigger a panic attack, because they avoid it. So the exposure part would be introducing some of those elements they find as triggers into the therapy.
Excellent information. I'm sure the listeners appreciate this, and I certainly appreciate the explanations. I want to go back to something you said earlier about anxiety and depression, because from what I read and in my experience, working as an intern, it seems like there's a large amount of anxiety and depression that are being treated in a mental health capacity. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely.
And let's just talk about a little bit about anxiety and depression, like what those things look like, because there might be some of our listeners, they're not understanding why they're having some of these issues or thoughts or behaviors. And maybe you could shed some light on possibly, getting some help for maybe something that they don't know what it is, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So depression can look sometimes very different than what people assume. It can be irritability, anger, mood swings. It could be a lack of feeling. Sometimes the biggest complaint I get from people is I just have no motivation. I just don't feel stuff. I don't care about things. It's not always just I'm sad. Actually, I think more often than not, it's more anger, irritability, and lack of feeling. Their relationships are suffering, and maybe they're exploding on people, or in a lot of conflict. With anxiety, you see a lot of poor sleep. Your mind is racing, thinking about the same multiple things and imagining worst case scenarios, feeling on edge, jumpy. Sometimes people can be quite angry because they're anxious, because anger is kind of a natural way to handle anxiety for people. So that might be some of the, if people are experiencing those things, then we'd be looking at like maybe this is something to do with depression or anxiety.
Yeah, those seem to be, in my experience, which is nowhere near yours, that I'm humbled, just being an intern and dealing with this. A large amount of clients that came in had a lot of anxiety with some depressed mood, that seemed to be mostly it. And also the comorbidity of addiction, like everyone was drinking, and then people are resistant to that. They're resistant to understanding that they're, their own, I don't have a drinking problem. I can leave the bar anytime I want. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
But that's a whole other topic, right?
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned something earlier about eating disorders, right?
Mm-hmm.
I find that interesting, because one of our upcoming shows, I'm going to interview an expert on physical fitness and nutrition for the first responder. And I have a degree, a master's in foods and nutrition from the University of Georgia. Go Bulldogs, #1. One of the things I find interesting are eating disorders. As it relates to first responders, I've always had this contention that their nutrition is horrible. And my capstone project at Georgia highlighted a plan for first responders, with supervision, because I think that people's accountability is important. If you have to check in weekly, you feel more like I have to do this.
Yeah.
And I found it interesting how, like an overeating, with a first responder seems to be pretty prevalent. Can you talk a little bit about the eating disorders and what that looks like and how it's treated?
Yeah. So, eating disorders, it's not just maybe what people assume is restricting eating, where people aren't eating. It could be, it's sort of on a continuum, really. Sometimes people will be fearful of gaining weight and not want to eat, so they're restricting, and then that might trigger overeating and binging, and then that might trigger some purging, and they sort of cycle through them. And some people will just restrict entirely because they're afraid to gain weight, and they're chasing some unrealistic number on the scale. And some people just really struggle with more binge eating, emotional eating, and purging. And so the treatment for that would be, again, like CBT and DBT, actually those two together, we use largely for people suffering from eating disorders, and then also a lot of coordinating care with other professionals. So primary care doctors, nutritionists, family.
Yeah. So supports are important as
Yep.
well with the eating disorders.
Yes. And it's
Okay.
almost like substance abuse in that sense too. It's difficult to treat because it's complex the way addiction is, and you really need to involve the individual's environment and shift that environment so that they have the best chance of success of beating it. You can't treat someone like an addict and then send them back out into the environment that they were in without changing the supports, right?
Right.
It's the same thing with eating disorders,
Right.
because there's a lot of environmental factors that have driven their behavior.
Well, it seems like almost sometimes when you're talking about supports, family supports, things like this, sometimes it thinks, I would imagine, and maybe I'm wrong, but people would, if they come from an environment that they're growing up consuming sugar sweetened beverages, mass produced processed foods, sugar, salt, fats, that kind of thing, that it's going to be difficult for them to get treatment and then have to go back into that environment, especially for somebody who's like a teenager. I mean, let me clarify, Dr. Augustine just doesn't treat first responders. She treats an array of different clients. I mean, she treats people who have been traumatized that are, teenagers from adults to, she treats an array of things. So, I mean, she's a licensed clinical psychologist, so she has a vast experience in all of these. That's why we're talking to her today and trying to educate our listeners, which include my mother, my mom, and the 4 other people that listen to this program. So, that's, I hope not true, but, and it's interesting because my mom's going to love this, she's going to love this. So I imagine it's hard for someone who comes from that environment. It's just like someone who hangs around with a bunch of people that, drink all day or do drugs. And then, they're expected to get sober and clean and then hang out with the same people. It just simply doesn't happen.
Right.
When I was going through my process of, alcohol recovery, which I still do, right? Meetings and things like that. I had friends like, well, why can't you just have one drink? I'm like, yeah, well, if I could do that, it'd be great. Right. I can't. So I imagine someone with an eating disorder is like, well, why don't you just have one Big Mac? Well, it's just simply not going to happen. But the converse is true too, isn't it, Jackie? That, eating disorders just aren't like overeating, but can you name some of the eating disorders and what they may look like for our listeners?
Yeah. So the restrictive type of eating disorder is traditionally known as anorexia, would be one. And a lot of times the people in that person's life may be reinforcing some really unhealthy ways of looking at food and how they behave around food and not even realize it. That could be like high dieting culture. I see lots of teenagers where, people in the family want to get fit, and that's great. You want to model healthy eating habits, but when there's so much focus on dieting to look better, to lose weight, it has a huge impact on teenagers and even younger kids, thinking that food is not okay, and they stop eating. So, you're going to see restricting, or sometimes it's eliminating certain food groups. Oh, she's suddenly a vegetarian. I see that one a lot, and they're scared about eating carbs, or they're only eating carrots all day, or, something like that. There's also a type of eating disorder where it's not really based around body image, but it's based around more of like food aversion. Like either someone had a traumatic event with like choking and they are terrified to eat and they end up losing weight. And it is an eating disorder, but it's really more about being fearful about food. And then of course you have bulimia, purging, and, people that overeat, binge eat, and purge, or sometimes it's just overeating. So, and many people can be a mix of some of these. So it's, on a continuum.
That's interesting stuff. And, for listeners, I'm sure they're, they're just striving for more information. Is there any resources that you could give our listeners that they might not feel like they want to go to therapy just yet, or, they want to do the WebMD thing, start searching the internet. I mean, you could tell people a million times, my I remember my best friend passed away from cancer, right? I worked with him on the SWAT team in Chicago. He was my commander, my best friend in the whole world. And he passed away. It'll be 5 years in April 17th, Easter Sunday, for you Catholics out there and Christians that celebrate Easter on the Catholic schedule. It's April 17th. It'll be 5-year anniversary. And I remember when he was going through the cancer treatment, the doctor told him, don't read anything unless it's a .org or it's, like a medical website or anything like that. And every time he'd go a little bit off, well, this website said this. I'm like, yeah, okay, that's someone's experience. So I get it. And as a college professor, I understand what the importance of credible sites are. Yeah. So could you share with some of our listeners, like what are some of the tips and clues, maybe if they're searching for some resources on the internet and they're just not ready to go get therapy, or maybe some people don't have insurance and they can't afford it, Yeah. Is there any suggestions you can make where they could go and find information on things, or perhaps if it's just go get help with a professional, maybe that's the advice. So
the nationaleatingdisorders.org is a good place to go. There's also a recovery center I often refer to. And if you're not ready quite to jump into treatment, but you want to check out their, website, it's the eatingrecoverycenter.com, and they have locations like all over the United States. And they use evidence-based treatment as well. Even if you're not ready to go there, you can, if you're willing, you have a good rapport with your primary care physician. Sometimes it's the first place to start, especially with kids. Because sometimes pediatricians are the first ones to notice, like, hey, what's, he or she dropped weight, and it was in a very small time span, like what's going on? And they might connect you with a nutritionist that specializes in eating disorders, and then maybe that person connects you to a therapist. So you would want to pursue someone who specializes in eating disorders, and that will work with a nutritionist and your primary care physician and your family. Like that, you really need that multi-team approach with this, just very similarly to addiction, because you sort of have to like all collaborate together. I mean, I treat many disorders in that way. I think it's always best to help your client get support and have really comprehensive treatment. But I think especially for eating disorders and substance abuse.
Excellent. And what would you say in the way of anxiety, depression, PTSD, those other things we talked about today? What do you think some resources our listeners could utilize to help themselves?
Yeah, I think, looking in of course, always looking in your community for, what are the mental health services nearby if you don't want to travel. Nowadays with teletherapy, it's really opened the door for a lot of people. Like I do teletherapy. So even though I work in both the west suburbs and the south suburbs, if you don't want to do the trip, you can always, you can do teletherapy. But you want to research you want to look up doctors that specialize in specific anxiety. If you feel you have a specific anxiety disorder, you're plugging in those terms. Psychology Today is actually a really good resource to look for doctors. The APA website as well, apa.org. So those two allow you to refine your search and look for a doctor that specializes in those issues, and you get a background on them. You see what insurance they take and things like that.
So Psychology Today, it's actually a great resource when you want to find somebody to, for treatment in your area. And then when you say APA.org, you mean the American Psychological Association, yep. Correct? Okay. Just so our listeners know, it's American Psychological Association. So APA.org. Jackie, substance abuse, right? Same thing, looking for people to help you with that. And what are some of the things that some of the listeners here are peer support people on police departments. And, a rule of thumb is when someone comes to you, a peer, right? Peer support programs are great. Someone comes to you, you're not a psychologist, you're not a counselor, right? When you're a peer support person, you're just another police officer, firefighter, whatever you may be, first responder. And this person's coming to you and saying, hey, I'm having these problems. I'm having these issues. I need some help. What kind of advice would you give a peer support person when someone comes to them with issues? What would you tell them to say or do?
So There's actually a really great thing to do is, obviously listening to this person coming to you, giving as much validation and support as you can, but also providing some, like the resources I just mentioned, but also maybe hotline numbers. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, SAMHSA, they have a national helpline that is really great to connect people with, because there might be times when they can't get a hold of supports or friends or family, and it's late at night, or they're having scary thoughts, they're really scared. This is confidential 24/7 every day of the year. It's 1-800-662-HELP. So there's quite a lot of free confidential hotlines that people can get connected with, and they will help you find the right resources for you as well, based on your specific problem. So I would recommend providing people with something written, write that down, a plan, like who are you contacting when you need somebody, how can we help you find a therapist? What are some hotline numbers you can call if you can't get a hold of me?
Excellent. Jackie, in about 2 minutes, tell us about your business, your location, where it's at, how people can get a hold of you, and what you're doing out there.
Yeah, so I'm located in New Lenox, Illinois. It's Jacqueline Augustine and Associates, and I've been working largely in a really great private practice in Naperville, and now trying to open up services for people in the south suburbs, because it really is very highly needed for families, for first responders. And so I'm using the experience I've had over the last 15 years to, help children, families, people of all ages, but also open up more support for families of first responders and first responders themselves, because people do forget that families also can suffer for quite a bit of depression, anxiety, just trying to understand what their spouse or their parent is going through as they deal with this really intense job, and they need supports too. So that's one of the other services I'm also providing, is family treatment, family support, and we do a wide variety of those evidence-based treatments we talked about. And I also do assessment and diagnostic testing. We also do wellness checks and critical debriefing for people with PTSD in the first responder community.
Excellent. And you have also therapists on staff there that can help, and interns, correct?
That's right. Like yourself.
There you go. Look at that. So there you go. Full disclosure. I'm an intern for Jackie. So there you go. So Jackie, if someone wants to get a hold of you, do you have a website, a phone number? Do you have both?
Yeah, right now we have a website. It's AugustineandAssociates.com.
Can you spell that for our listeners? Spell it so they.
It's AUGUSTINEAND spelled out. Associates, ASSOCIATES.com. And I also have, if you want to email me at Jackie, it's Jackie at AugustinePSYD.com. I can take some intake calls that way. And the number is 708-512-7709. And so if you're thinking about getting help, or you have more questions, you can always call me at that number.
Excellent. Jackie, thank you for coming. Dr. Augustine, you've been listening to Everyday Warriors, and our guest has been Dr. Jacqueline Augustine of Jacqueline Augustine and Associates in New Lenox, Illinois, licensed clinical psychologist. Everyday Warriors is a show that highlights the heroes of everyday life. We don't talk about politics or politicians, music stars, movie stars. We talk about the real heroes, and Jackie Augustine is a real hero with the work she's doing, not only with first responders, but in the mental health community in general. I am your host, Dr. Danny McGuire, and you're listening to WVLP 103.1 FM, Valparaiso, Indiana. Thank you for listening, and tune in next week for more information and more guests. Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you.